Honey dripped slowly through the trembling fingers of the man who once made Rome tremble. Golden, viscous, sticky, each drop carried the weight of a cruel irony that even the most vengeful gods couldn't have conceived. Mithridates VI of Pontus, the king of poisons, the one who had spent decades building a supernatural resistance to every lethal substance known to man, was now bound to a tree, his naked body coated in a sweet substance that would attract the slowest, most agonizing death imaginable. The buzzing of insects began to echo through the humid forest, a macabre chorus heralding the end of an era. His swollen eyelids could barely open, but through the painful slits he could still see the Roman soldiers watching from a distance, their faces a mixture of morbid fascination and primal horror. General Pompey had personally ordered this execution, not just as punishment, but as a spectacle that would be recounted for generations. "Let him taste his own medicine," he had said, referring to the years of chemical warfare Mithridates had inflicted on Roman armies. Now, in 63 BC, in the shadowy forests near the Black Sea, the man who had defied 3 generations of Roman generals was about to discover that there is something worse than any poison: nature in its most primal and unrelenting form. Mithridates' body, once imposing and majestic, now trembled involuntarily as the honey spread across his wrinkled skin, etched by decades of war. At 68, he was a shadow of the powerful king who had once controlled territories stretching from the Black Sea to Asia Minor. His hair, once black and abundant, now thin and gray, clung to his scalp, matted by the sweet liquid dripping from his brow. The muscles that once wielded swords with legendary strength were now just flaccid flesh hanging on weary bones. But to understand the magnitude of this fall, one must return to the days when Mithridates was more than a king. He was a nightmare haunting the dreams of Roman senators. Born in 134 BC, he had inherited the throne of Pontus at the age of 11, but his true ascent began when he systematically eliminated all rivals, including his own mother and brothers. From a young age, obsessed with the idea that he would be murdered by poisoning, a common practice among Hellenistic royalty, he began ingesting small doses of various poisons, building a resistance that would become legendary. The palace at Sinope, his capital, transformed into a macabre laboratory where slaves were used to test lethal combinations. Mithridates possessed a collection of over 50 different antidotes, each meticulously tested and refined. His personal physician, Cratous, documented in detailed scrolls every experiment, every reaction, every death. The king not only survived multiple attempts at poisoning, but developed such intense paranoia that he personally tasted all food and drink before consuming it. His first war against Rome began in 88 BC when he invaded the Roman province of Asia. What followed was a bloodbath known as the Ephesian Vespers. In a single day, on Mithridates' orders, 80,000 Roman and Italian citizens were massacred throughout Asia Minor. Men, women, and children were killed wherever they were found, their property confiscated, their bodies left to rot under the scorching sun. The king sent the severed heads of leading Roman magistrates to Rome, wrapped in purple silk, as a sinister gift. For 25 years, Mithridates fought 3 consecutive wars against Rome, facing successively the generals Sulla, Lucullus, and finally Pompey. He employed tactics that the Romans considered cowardly and dishonorable: poisoning wells, using toxin-tipped arrows, and even launching clay pots containing scorpions and vipers at enemy troops. His armies were a motley collection of Greeks, Persians, Scythians, and Germans, united only by their shared hatred of Rome. The king had become a master of psychological warfare. Before important battles, he sent poisoned gifts to Roman commanders: rare wines that killed within hours, perfumes that caused blindness, jewels that released toxins upon contact with sweat. Plutarch recounts that some Roman generals developed such paranoia that they refused to touch any object that hadn't been previously examined by expendable slaves. But it was during the siege of Cyzicus in 73 BC that Mithridates' reputation reached its darkest peak. Surrounded by Lucullus's forces and facing starvation in his own city, he ordered the defenders to feed on the bodies of the war dead. When even this macabre source was exhausted, he personally oversaw the execution of citizens deemed unuseful. The elderly, sick children, pregnant women, their bodies processed into a sort of nutritive paste that kept the soldiers alive for a few more weeks. Roman historians, though obviously biased, preserved terrifying accounts of Mithridates' methods. Appian describes how he kept a secret garden in his palace where he cultivated the most poisonous plants in the known world. Hemlock from Greece, belladonna from Germania, aconite from the Alps. He possessed snakes of 16 different species, each bred specifically to produce poisons with distinct effects. Some killed instantly, others caused gradual paralysis, and the most refined induced a slow, irreversible madness. Diodorus Siculus mentions intercepted letters in which Mithridates described with clinical detail the effects of his creations. Mandrake extract mixed with viper's gall, he wrote to an ally, produces a death that perfectly simulates a heart attack. The subject experiences chest pain, difficulty breathing, and finally collapses as if touched by the gods. No Roman physician could distinguish it from a natural death. But perhaps the most unsettling aspect of Mithridates' personality was his obsession with his own mortality. He had constructed an elaborate mausoleum in Amasya, his hometown, where he planned to be buried in a solid gold sarcophagus. However, he was so terrified of being buried alive that he ordered the construction of complex mechanisms that would allow escape from the tomb should he awaken after the funeral. Bronze tubes were installed to supply air, levers allowed the sarcophagus to be opened from within, and a system of ropes connected the interior of the tomb to bells that would alert the guards to any movement. His last allies began to abandon him when they realized that his paranoia had become more dangerous than the Romans themselves. Archelaus, his most loyal general, was executed by Mithridates after 20 years of faithful service, simply because he had questioned a particularly irrational order. Dorieus, his personal physician, was tortured to death because Mithridates suspected he was being bribed by Rome to poison his remedies. The situation reached a critical point when Pharnacus, Mithridates' youngest son, led an open revolt against his father. In a letter preserved by Plutarch, Pharnacus wrote, "My father is no longer a king, but a dangerous madman who will kill us all if he is not stopped. He sees enemies where there are only shadows, and poison where there is only food. Rome may be cruel, but at least its generals don't execute their own sons because of nightmares." Confronting the betrayal of his own son, Mithridates finally understood that his obsession with survival had destroyed everything he loved. In intimate letters discovered after his death, he wrote, "I built a fortress against death, but became a prisoner of my own making. Every antidote I took distanced me further from true life. Every poison I survived made me more venomous to those around me." The ultimate irony of Mithridates' existence became apparent when he attempted suicide. Desperate and surrounded by Pompey's forces, he repeatedly tried to end his life, but his famed resistance to poisons had become a curse. He ingested doses that would kill 10 normal men, yet his body, conditioned by decades of gradual exposure, simply absorbed them without lethal effect. Appian reports that he even drank a concoction of hemlock, arsenic, and strychnine he had specifically prepared for this moment, but managed only to violently vomit for hours without dying. The execution was carefully planned to maximize both physical and psychological suffering. Mithridates was bound to an ancient oak tree in the middle of a dense forest, where the sound of his screams would be muffled by the vegetation. His arms were stretched above his head and secured with bronze cords that gradually cut off circulation. His legs were bound separately, preventing any movement that might scare away the insects soon to come. The honey used wasn't common. It was a dark, thick variety produced by bees that fed on poisonous plants. Ironically, this honey contained traces of toxins that would normally be lethal, but which Mithridates' body absorbed without mortal effect. The sticky liquid was applied slowly, starting at his feet and gradually rising, each inch methodically coated as Roman soldiers silently watched. First came the ants. Tiny, black, almost invisible, they emerged from the cracks in the tree's bark and began cautiously exploring this new food source. Mithridates felt the first stings as tiny points of fire on his skin, but he maintained his composure, breathing deeply and attempting to enter a meditative state he had learned from Greek philosophers. But the ants were only the beginning. As the sweet scent spread through the forest, other insects began to arrive. Large, buzzing flies landed on his eyes and nostrils, their hairy legs walking across his eyelids as they tried to reach the honey dripping down his face. He tried to shake his head violently, but this only caused the honey to run faster, creating new points of attraction. After an hour, wasps began to appear. Unlike honeybees, these were wild wasps with stingers that could sting repeatedly. They initially focused on the small wounds caused by the ants, where the scent of blood mixed with honey created an irresistible aroma. Each wasp sting injected a venom that, while not lethal to someone with Mithridates resistance, caused intense pain and swelling. What made the ordeal even more horrific was the constant awareness. Unlike normal victims who might go into shock or faint from the pain, Mithridates' conditioned body kept functioning at full capacity. He remained conscious throughout the entire process, able to feel every sting, every bite, every movement of the insects on his skin. As the day wore on, larger insects began to arrive. Beetles congregated on his open wounds, their mandibles tearing off small pieces of skin that had been softened by the honey. Earthworms emerged from the damp soil, attracted by the scent of decay that was already starting to emanate from the infected wounds. Even venomous centipedes descended from the trees, their numerous legs tickling his skin as they searched for places to lay their eggs. During the second night, Mithridates experienced a torment that no poison could inflict. Mosquitoes arrived in clouds, the sound of their wings creating a constant buzz that would drive any normal person insane. They concentrated on his ears, nostrils, and corners of his eyes, areas where the honey had accumulated and where the skin was thinnest. Each bite added more venom to his system, but instead of causing death, it only intensified his agony. Even more disturbing was the appearance of maggots. Blowflies, attracted by the smell of decaying flesh, began to lay eggs in his wounds. Mithridates could feel the maggots moving under his skin, eating the dead tissue and creating new channels of pain. He tried to scream, but his throat was so swollen from the stings that only guttural sounds could escape. By the third day, his appearance had been completely transformed. His face was so swollen that it was impossible to recognize the features that had once been familiar throughout the Mediterranean world. His eyes were closed shut from swelling, but he could still hear the constant buzzing of the insects and their legs walking across his skin. His skin, once pale, was now covered in a mixture of crystallized honey, congealed blood, and fragments of dead insects. But perhaps the cruelest aspect of this execution was the fact that Mithridates remained mentally lucid. His mind, honed by decades of discipline and conditioning, continued to function perfectly, even as his body was slowly consumed. He could hear the Roman soldiers conversing in the distance, discussing mundane details of their personal lives as they watched his agony. He could hear birds singing in the trees, the sound of leaves rustling in the wind, and even the distant rumble of caravans passing on the nearby road. During moments of lucidity, Mithridates reflected on the irony of his situation. He had spent his entire life trying to conquer death through science and chemistry, but now he was dying in the most primitive way possible, being devoured by creatures that existed long before humans invented poisons. There was something profoundly symbolic in the fact that his death came not from a refined man-made substance, but from thousands of tiny creatures following their most basic instincts. On the fourth night, vultures began to circle above the tree. Though Mithridates was still technically alive, the smell of decomposition had become so intense that larger predators began to investigate. Rats emerged from nearby burrows, initially cautious, but gradually bolder as they realized their prey was defenseless. They began to gnaw on Mithridates' toes, where the honey had crystallized and the skin was softer. The most disturbing sound, however, was Mithridates' own breathing. Each inhale was a Herculean effort, as his airways were partially blocked by swelling. He breathed in irregular patterns, sometimes seeming almost dead, only to resume breathing with a rasping sound that frightened even the Roman soldiers accustomed to violence. By the fifth day, witnesses reported that Mithridates' body had become more insect than human. Layers of creatures constantly moved over his skin, creating a living surface that pulsed and writhed. His wounds had become nests for various insect species, and eggs could be seen in his ears and nostrils. Yet, miraculously, he remained alive, his heart stubbornly beating against all odds. It was only on the sixth day that Mithridates finally died, not from the insects or the poison, but from sheer exhaustion. His body, conditioned to withstand toxins but not prolonged physical trauma, simply ceased to function. His last breath was almost inaudible, just a gentle sigh that mingled with the constant buzzing of the insects that had become his final companions. When news of Mithridates' death reached Rome, the reaction was complex and contradictory. On the one hand, there were celebrations in the streets. The great enemy had finally been defeated. On the other hand, there was a sense of unease with the brutality of the execution. Even among the most seasoned senators, many privately expressed that perhaps Rome had gone too far in its vengeance. Plutarch, writing decades later, observed that Mithridates' death marked a turning point in Roman history. At that moment, he wrote, Rome showed that it was capable of a cruelty that rivaled that of the very barbarians it sought to civilize. The death of Mithridates was not merely the destruction of an enemy, but the revelation that absolute power can transform even the most civilized into monsters. Mithridates' body was left in the tree for 3 more days after his death, serving as a warning to anyone who considered defying Rome. When it was finally removed, it was so disfigured that it was impossible to identify with certainty whether it was truly the famed king. Pompey ordered the remains to be publicly burned, but he preserved the skull as a personal trophy. Ironically, Mithridates' death created a legend that far surpassed his life. Stories about the Poison King spread throughout the ancient world, inspiring both fear and admiration. Alchemists attempted to replicate his antidotes, physicians studied his methods, and even enemies of Rome began to see him as a symbol of resistance against imperial tyranny. Even more disturbing, the execution technique used against Mithridates did not die with him. Fragmentary records suggest that similar methods were subsequently used against other enemies of Rome, refined and perfected based on the experience gained. Pompey himself apparently kept written details of the process, which were studied by subsequent generations of Roman executioners. Mithridates' death also revealed something dark about human nature. The soldiers who observed his execution later reported that despite the initial horror, they gradually became accustomed to the spectacle. Some even placed bets on how long he would survive. Others made technical observations about the effectiveness of different types of insects. The trivialization of extreme cruelty showed how even the most ordinary people can adapt to unthinkable levels of violence. In letters preserved in the imperial archives, Pompey wrote to the Senate, "Mithridates' death serves as a reminder that Rome does not merely punish its enemies, but destroys them in ways that make others think twice before challenging us. It is not enough to win. One must win so completely that the very memory of resistance is erased." However, Pompey's plan failed in one crucial aspect. Instead of erasing the memory of Mithridates, his cruel death only amplified his legend. Decades later, when Rome faced other revolts and wars, Mithridates' name was invoked as a symbol of resistance. Rebel leaders studied his tactics, alchemists tried to replicate his poisons, and even some Romans began to question whether his execution had been necessary or merely sadistic. The story of Mithridates remains one of the darkest chapters of antiquity, not only for his life of paranoia and violence, but for his death, which revealed the depths of human cruelty. He had dedicated his entire existence to the pursuit of immortality through science, only to discover that true death comes not from refined substances, but from nature in its most primitive and unrelenting form. Over 2,000 years later, as we gaze upon the archaeological remnants of Mithridates' kingdom, crumbling palaces, shattered laboratories, poisonous gardens long turned to dust, we are confronted with questions that transcend ancient history. What happens when the pursuit of security morphs into paranoia? When the fear of death becomes more destructive than death itself? And to what extent is civilization merely a thin veneer masking primal urges of revenge and cruelty? Mithridates' death wasn't just the end of a man or even an era, but a revelation about the fundamental nature of power and human mortality. He had attempted to transcend the limitations of the flesh through science and alchemy, but discovered that true immortality doesn't come from avoiding death, but from accepting our fragility as part of the human condition. His ultimate tragedy was realizing only when it was too late that a life lived in constant fear of death isn't true life, but a sophisticated form of being already dead. The honey that streamed over his body in those final days carries a symbolism the Romans themselves may not have fully grasped. Sweet on the surface, yet lethal in its application, it represents the very nature of absolute power, attractive and seductive, yet capable of destroying both those who wield it and those who oppose it. And the insects that devoured Mithridates were not merely agents of execution, but symbols of nature itself, patient, persistent, and ultimately more powerful than any human ambition. In the end, Mithridates' story serves as a somber reminder that no matter how sophisticated we become, how elaborate our plans to conquer death, or how powerful we feel, we all eventually face the same fate. The only difference is whether we choose to live with dignity or consume ourselves in paranoia and fear. Mithridates chose fear and discovered that fear, when taken to its extreme, can be more deadly than any poison ever concocted by man.